right, so like Nate said, I am the policy, I'm a bit short for this, so I'm gonna move over here actually. I'm the policy manager at Prosperity, Indiana. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about what that is, but today in general, I'm gonna be talking about affordable housing here in the area based on some specific data that we have access to that's kind of exclusive. And also housing advocacy, which is a big part of my job. Feel free to ask questions at any time because a lot of this presentation builds on itself. So I don't want you to be confused about something early on and then it ruins your understanding of something later on. So, maybe? Oh, hold on. I'm working on it, folks. This is touchy. Okay, I got it. So Prosperity, Indiana, if you haven't heard of us, we are the statewide association for community economic development here in Indiana, which is a really long name, and that's why we changed it to Prosperity, Indiana a few years ago. But what we do is exactly in the name. So we are an association, we have a membership that pay us annual dues, and if you are part of that membership, we provide special services to you. We also have a couple of services that are completely public and free, mostly our advocacy work, because we feel that it's just that important to get people involved. Oh dear, it's just doing what it wants, isn't it? My apologies. But yeah, essentially what I want to share is that we have around 200 organizations statewide that are members with us. You can see here kind of the layout here. We have 66% are nonprofit organizations, and I will say at least half of those are developers, and probably about half or maybe a third of the private organizations are also developers. So this is very much the same space that we are usually working in, and a lot of direct service nonprofits as well. But lots of banks and local governments are also members with us. We basically say that anyone can be a member with us as long as your goal is to strengthen your community, especially the community economic development side of it. So if you're interested in this, I can tell you more about it later, but this is not a sales pitch. That is not my job. So, like I said, I do have some data for you guys that is specific to this county. Something that Prosperity, Indiana does, again, actually I didn't go over it on the other slide, but we provide resources, engagement, advocacy, and programs. Less on the program side, most on all the others. And obviously I'm under the advocacy side, but I also work really closely with our resources, and part of that is data. So as for data, there are a couple of reports that we release annually, and it's exclusive data that only we have access to, along with some national organizations. So we work really closely with them to release their big national report, and then we also release a state level report that analyzes like county level data. Unfortunately, it's really hard to get data lower than county level, but we do get to have that county level data that is just for us. So I'm gonna go through some of that. Some of it may be familiar to you, some of it you may have even seen in the news. We're lucky to get really good coverage every time we release these reports. But I think it really sets the stage for some things that you've probably already observed in other ways in your community. So I'm just gonna jump into that. One of the big reports that we do is called The Gap, and we're gonna be re-releasing it in a few months, I believe. But this is about the gap in affordable housing for those who need it the most. So we have the statewide data, and then again, we have some county level stuff that I will get into. But this is kind of our best snapshot of what we know. So in the state of Indiana, you can see down here, there are 39 affordable and available rental units for every 100 lowest income Hoosiers that need them. And we also have that number for every single county, so I will get to that for Delaware County. But that's really bad. I want to say that is below the Midwest average, that is below the national average. So even though people advertise Indiana as this affordable place to live, we are actually really lacking for certain income brackets. So if you are at 100% area median income, you're a basic market rate, making good money in your community type of person, there are 105 units for every 100 that needs it. That's a tight market, that's not great. You know, it could be better for sure, you'd have more options, that would be nice, but there's not actually a deficit there, it's just a tight market. And then again, when you're at 80% of area median income, maybe you are a young adult who is entering the workforce and getting used to things, but you still make a decent amount of money for where you live. There's 103 for every 100 of you. Again, really tight market, not great, but not actually a deficit. That's not where the need exists. But here we get into the 50% of area median income and everything below that, the extremely low income Hoosiers, they are experiencing quite noticeable deficits. We do not have enough units for these people that are affordable and available. And the available part is obvious. I think we all can understand what that means. It's on the market or it's not. But the affordable part, I think, is worth talking about. All the time, legislators will kind of derail conversations by saying, well, what is affordable? And then they try and go on and on about some sort of definition. And I always try and stop them and say, actually, there's a pretty well-accepted definition nationally and with a lot of organizations like the folks in this room. And that is that you are not spending more than 30% of your income on housing costs. That's it. That's the definition. It's based on your area median income, which is very easy to look up for pretty much any county in the United States. So that's the definition that we are going off of here. And then we can also talk about if you're spending more than 50% of your area median income on housing, then that means that you are severely housing cost burdened. And that puts you at risk of things like eviction and homelessness because that market is so tight and there's nowhere else for you to go.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Does housing costs include utilities?
In this data, yes. However, it really depends on the source, and I always encourage you to check. But this is our data with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and it does include utilities.
It's 35,
yeah.
299, is that the average? Is that the median household for a state? What is the median household?
Oh, so that's the annual household income needed to afford a 2-bedroom home rental unit. And I will get into the cost a little bit more. I've got a different slide for that because that data is a bit interesting. But that is one of the other big reports that we release a year.
When you talk about the income for
Yeah.
what you just covered, what is that number? What's the median income?
Well, it depends on county.
Oh, okay.
So every county is vastly different. Like if I compared, Indy to South Bend to Muncie, they're all super different. So I actually can't remember if I included it, but if I didn't, I'll send it to Nate so that you have it. One more thing I want to touch on this slide in particular is this little wheel here, and I know it's hard to read. Nate, hopefully you can make these slides available to everybody.
Computer back so you can see the corner of the...
Should I touch it? I heard it was touchy.
Just the podium.
How about, is this okay?
That's better.
Okay, great.
Because my computer will turn off.
Yeah, I don't want to bump it and have it turn off. So this wheel here, this is about who those extremely low-income Hoosiers are, just because people often ask, well, who are these people? Especially those that are, again, in that bottom bracket. There's only 39 affordable and available homes for every 100 that need it. So who these people are, 36% of them are in the labor force full-time. So really, a big chunk of these people are regular, everyday working people. That's something that I have to tell legislators all the time, is that these are not people who don't have jobs. A lot of them do. Also, you will see that 21% of them are disabled. So if they don't have a job, that's a pretty darn good reason, right? 26% of them are seniors. Again, a good reason why they may not have a job, but they still obviously deserve housing. And I can also tell you that just last year, that number was 21%. So in 1 year alone, it has gone up by 5% in Indiana, and we expect that to continue. The number of housing unstable seniors in Indiana is going to continue to rise based on the trends that we've seen. And we do work very closely with AARP, so I have that to validate as well. And then you can also see that 5% of these extremely low-income Hoosiers are in school, or they are single adult caregivers, taking care of someone in their family who may be disabled or a senior or something like that. So that's just a quick snapshot of who these people are in real life. Oh, too far. Really quickly, same type of data. I just want to point out that, again, this is something I have to tell legislators all the time, is that this is not just an Indianapolis problem. It's very easy to get convinced that these things are only happening in high population, very urban areas, and sometimes they'll name off the cities they think it's happening in, and they say, but it's not happening anywhere else in Indiana. And that is so wrong, and we have the data to prove it. So I actually just highlighted here, Delaware County is on here. I forgot to unhighlight White County, and I apologize, that's from a different presentation. But what you can see, that red line is the national average. So Delaware County has even less affordable and available rental units than the national average. So that's, important to point out that this is not just happening in super urban places. You'll also see Clinton County. My partner's family is from there. It is incredibly rural, but it is still below the national average for affordable rental units. So just want to point out again, not just Indy. That is a really regular thing that we hear, and we have the data to prove that it's simply not true. So here's the gap data specifically for Delaware County. And again, you will get all of this to look at later, but we have here the deficit or surplus of units, so it's kind of the same thing, but we're talking about the actual raw numbers that are estimated. And just so you know, all of this data is about 2 years back because that's just how data analytics go. It's really hard to have it exactly accurate for 2024. But we will have more updated data very soon. So you'll see that in the absolute lowest income bracket, which is 30% of area median income or below, there is a gap of almost 4,000 affordable and available rental units in Delaware County. They don't exist, but people do need them. We also have that for 50% of area median income because people ask about that a lot. And then because some of these raw numbers are harder for people to work with, I also included several segments of the same type of data, but again, out of that, every 100 who needs it. So for the lowest income, for every 100 that needs it in Delaware County, there's only 28 available. That is a huge deficit. That is worse than the statewide deficit and the national deficit for how many units people need. And then also, I mentioned this earlier, the severely housing cost burdened individuals. Those are people who are paying more than 50% of their income. You can see the breakdown for that as well. Pretty unsurprisingly, the absolute lowest income bracket, 78% of them are spending more than half their income on housing. And it gets less and less as you go up. So in Delaware County, if you are at the greater than 80% of area median income, relatively market rate, doing pretty well, only 1% of those people are paying more than half of their income on housing. Unsurprising, and this follows the trend throughout the rest of the state. Okay. Now here we're on the housing cost side, which I think is what you were a little bit more interested in. And we do have a full report for this. This is just one tiny screenshot. So definitely recommend looking at the full report if you are interested in that. I have the link here, so you should be able to find it later. But what we list is the cost of a 2-bedroom apartment unit at fair market rent, which is determined by HUD. So we already know this number is not even right, because we all know that HUD's determination of these things is a little bit generous. It's not really accurate to what we're seeing in reality for how much people are struggling and what the market is really doing. And we always advocate for HUD to correct their formula and bring it a little bit more modernized. But as of now, this is what we have to work with. So supposedly, in Delaware County, the cost of a fair market 2-bedroom apartment is $851. I bet it's way more than that. But this is the base that we have for the data that exists. And then you can also see, I did actually include area median income on this, so hopefully that's helpful to you. Area median income for the actual market rate, 100% people who are doing great in this area, is $70,000 for Delaware County. And that, again, this is all based on national data that we have available. We have some really great statisticians that work on this to try and make it as accurate as possible. But if you disagree with something, you think it's not quite right, you're probably right. There's probably some things that could be improved. It's just we work with what we have. There's not too much more I'll say about this. I really encourage you to read the report if you find this pretty interesting. But I'll point out the hourly renter wage is about $13 here in Delaware County. But in order to actually make the rent that is probably not even right, it's probably higher than that. But if you were going to make that rent, you'd need to be making at least $16 an hour. So the average wage, the average hourly wage in this area is not enough to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment at fair market value. And that is only if this number were even correct, but it's probably not, it's probably even higher. So that's the kind of struggle people are going through. Yeah?
You maybe already mentioned, what's the name of the report?
Yes, this one is, I guess that is the technical long title. My supervisor, Andrew, really likes to write newspaper long titles for some of our reports. So technically that is the title there in blue, but if you click it, no matter what, it will take you to the proper report. I wanted to make sure that was available for you guys. This data is actually not data that we co-release with any national organization. I do know the national organizations that release these, but it's just so relevant to the conversation that I throw it in there anyway. And that's our eviction filings and households behind on rent, which is indicative of future eviction filings. So if you didn't already know, Indiana has some of the worst eviction filings in the entire country. People just being removed from their homes. Also, in particular, Indianapolis is a standout on this, and that's not saying other areas are not. It's just that we have really good data for Indianapolis, and it's actually a lot harder to get small claims court data from smaller counties. But actually, like, Indianapolis is worse than San Francisco, Chicago, New York City. We have worse eviction rates than they do. So that's kind of something that feeds into this problem. But I think you can logically understand why. In a way, it's because people can't afford to live here. There are other things feeding into it too. Our actual eviction system in Indiana is really dark and unfair, frankly, and that's something that we lobby for every year. But just understanding the cost alone and those issues and the supply issues does partially explain what's going on here. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. Oops. This is quite touchy. So taking like a quick step back, my title is policy manager at Prosperity Indiana, so my job has a couple of components. One, I do a lot of data management, but two, I would say my job is to manage the advocates. So there are a couple of different parts to that. We have Prosperity Indiana members, we also have coalition partners, and then we have the general public, all of which we want to be engaged in advocacy. And part of that means educating about what advocacy even is. Something that I hear a lot from nonprofits is, well, I don't think my organization lets me do any lobbying, so I'm just not going to talk to a legislator. And that is my chance to jump in and say, actually, there's a pretty legal definition for what is lobbying, and there's a difference between education and lobbying. You know, really quick rundown for you guys. Education is talking about your community and the facts that you know and the stories you've heard from your clients and things like that. You can tell a legislator any of that, and that is perfectly fine. You do not have to report it. If you want to lobby, though, if that's something you're comfortable with, by the way, every nonprofit can lobby. There's just a certain amount you can do. But if that's something you want to do, all that is just making an ask or insinuating an ask, or if you have like a broader constituency, then asking them to make an ask, if that makes sense. So asking Representative Arrington to author a bill, to sign a bill, to vote for a bill, to vote against a bill, that is all lobbying, really in any form. But if you think about it, you only have to track the number of hours you spend doing that, and that takes about 15 minutes. So I just want to encourage anyone who may be interested in doing lobbying to understand that it's not nearly as limited as you think it is, and I'm available as a resource to talk about that. It's part of my job. Also, though, part of my job, again, is talking about our coalitions and our members and making sure they have opportunities to engage. So that's why Nate was at the Statehouse. Part of my job is to convene our annual Statehouse Day, which is an opportunity for people, our members, our partners from all over the state, to come into the Statehouse, get clear directions, get to go on tours, get to go to meetings that I will set up for you, so that you have the experience of what it's like, and to make it not so scary, to make you feel comfortable to invite Representative Arrington and maybe other legislators to meetings like this, because you can. My whole goal is to make you feel like you can do those things. So that's a quick overview of my job. I think it's a good lead up into some of the things I'm going to talk about now. This is actually pictures from last year's Statehouse Day. Again, our recent one was just Wednesday, so I'm still recovering from that. I have not uploaded the pictures yet. But here are some pictures of last year in case anybody is interested in that in the future. And also things that I do as part of that education and enabling to make sure people feel like they can advocate is trainings. So if you're interested in that, happy to talk about it any time, but some of those things I just went through about what is education and what is lobbying. I also host webinars on things like how do you build a relationship with a legislator? Because we all know, hopefully, that the best time to ask for something is not when you need it right now. It's to ask for it beforehand and make sure they understand what the issue is in advance. Building a relationship so they know who you are, so they know that you're trustworthy, that you're a voice of your community. So trainings on that sort of thing is also something I offer. And those are usually free, by the way. So that's part of what Prosperity Indiana members do. They're engaged a lot in those things, but a lot of them are free, like I said. But we also have partners that are not even Prosperity Indiana members. Like I said, we just think that advocacy is so important that I'm willing to welcome anybody to the table who wants to be there. And part of the way that we do that is through partnerships, through coalitions. So housing is not actually the only issue Prosperity Indiana works on, as you can imagine. We actually have 3 statewide advocacy coalitions, and I lead all 3 of them. So one of them is this group, the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition. But I also convene 2 other groups, the Indiana Assets and Opportunity Network, and that group is all about asset building, financial savings, empowerment, public benefits and programs, that sort of thing if that's interesting to you. That's our oldest coalition. It has over 2,000 members statewide. It's about 7 or 8 years old, I want to say. And then we also have Hoosiers for Responsible Lending, which really gets at predatory payday lending and large installment loan lending that goes after vulnerable Hoosiers, which I know Representative Arrington also knows a lot about. And that's not what I came to talk about today, but again, if anybody's interested, it's another coalition we have, and it's another policy area I work in all the time. And that group just had recently hit over 1,000 members statewide, so that's exciting.
What was the first advocacy group that?
Yeah, I know they're long names. It's the Indiana Assets and Opportunity Network.
Okay.
I usually call it A&O. But yeah, that is one of the other coalitions I lead. And the coalitions are really an avenue for people to get involved and get the intel that they want. So the one that is more relevant to today's group is the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition, and I usually call it HHNC. It's a lot easier. But the priorities for this group are housing stability, affordability, tenant protections, housing equity, homeownership, really just anything related to housing. This group is one of our youngest. I believe it began right around the inception of COVID because there were a lot of direct service providers who were saying they're discussing housing at the statehouse right now and people are vulnerable and we need to talk to them. So they got together to talk to the legislators. So only about 4 years old, this group. Nonetheless, it's our fastest growing group. We already have over 2,500 members statewide. It's already larger than our oldest coalition. And I think that just really speaks to how serious this issue is right now and how much people want to get involved and how concerned they are. But by joining this coalition or any of the others I mentioned, just know that it's essentially an email listserv, so you don't have to do this rigorous sign-up process. There's no fee or anything. It's totally free. But what you can get is educational webinars that are specific to housing or the other issues, and also newsletters. I send out quarterly newsletters to help keep you in the loop on things that I frankly don't expect you to track in your daily job. You have other parts of your job that may not have anything at all to do with advocacy, but to keep you in the loop, we have these newsletters so that you can see what's going on. Not everybody has time to track policy. Tracking policy is part of my job, but it's not part of your job. Also, we try and provide accessible ways to engage in public policy, trying to coordinate legislators in large groups in your area so that you can come talk to them about your housing concerns. That's a common thing. We also create action alerts. So again, you may not be tracking policy, but we do. So if there's a really concerning bill, a bill that's a bad bill, and we need people to know about it quickly and let their legislators know how they feel about it, we'll send out an action alert email about it. There's also leadership opportunities and networking opportunities. Like I said, this group already has over 2,500 members statewide. So if you are interested in all those things I just discussed, then you probably want to meet some of the other people in this group, developers all over the states, nonprofits all over the states, all working on different types of solutions and facing different issues. And then, like I said, leadership opportunities. Every single one of our coalitions, all 3 of them, have a steering committee as well. So if somebody ends up being a really excellent partner and they're showing up a lot in these coalition calls, they've got all the right questions, they're interested and they want to engage more, then we may elect them to the steering committee to lead the group. And that's important because those are my experts. I am 25 years old. I know how to lobby, but I am not a housing expert on literally everything. That's why I have a steering committee to turn to ask my questions, to get their opinions. We vote on every policy we pursue so that you guys know, the general membership of the coalition, that when we take a step and we make a decision, a lot of experts were consulted. So just in case you're curious about who those experts are, right now, this is the current steering committee. These are the experts I consult all the time. I have a private email listserv with them, and I email them all the time. I'm sure they hate it. But these are the experts I'm always consulting. So hopefully there are a lot of names you recognize, but there may be some that you don't, because we also try and involve smaller, more local groups to get that perspective as well. I don't want to just talk to the state policy head honchos of AARP and the Corporation for Supportive Housing. I also want to talk to the Indianapolis Tenant Association with the Ross Foundation. I want to talk to those people too. So that is kind of the crew that I work with on a regular basis to do this kind of work. So this is kind of where we get into what is the work. But I can't easily talk about this legislative session, which is currently happening, without very briefly talking about last legislative session, because every year it very much builds on itself. So last legislative session, some key takeaways. Part of the key takeaways actually was something that built up to it, which was the Housing Task Force. And if you don't know anything about the Indiana General Assembly and how they do their legislative things, it's pretty common for them to have study committees and task forces. And the whole thing is where they get together in the summer and they choose an issue and they study it. They bring in different experts to do testimony, they take notes, and they try and brainstorm policy solutions. So it's really interesting to watch what these task forces and study committees are when they're announced in the spring, to see what they're about, what their topics are, because it very much suggests what kind of bills we're going to see in the next session. So last fall, we had the Housing Task Force. And my organization was really excited about this. We're thinking, yes, there's a housing task force. That means we're really going to work on some substantial housing policy in Indiana. It's so time for that. We were pretty disappointed, though. So these task forces, they can be made up in different ways. They're mostly legislators. Sometimes there's state agency heads that come and be an official voting member of these. And then sometimes there are community leaders as well. So we were really lucky to have an official position on this legislative task force. We only had one to represent pretty much all Hoosier consumers, which is unfortunate. But we did have a spot. Nonetheless, though, we really had to battle to get them to care about the lowest income Hoosiers. They wanted to talk about other things. So the key recommendations from this committee, and that's what they usually do, these committees or task forces will issue a report of recommendations for policy next year. They wanted to do state funding for housing infrastructure. Residential TIFs were a huge topic, and I am just simply not educated enough to talk about that much. But just so you know, they were talking about it a lot. There was some consideration of zoning reform, but I will say it hasn't really gotten that far yet. Tax incentives were a big topic. The READY program obviously is in full swing again. And then the tiny, tiny byline that we fought very fiercely for was support for addressing substandard housing, which is something that we know a lot of people are living in. And I think, as Nate really eloquently put in a lot of our legislator meetings the other day, this is sort of the front end of the back end of the problem that land banks see, is this substandard housing. When we see out-of-state investors, often turning them into rental properties, just extracting as much as they can from a property until they abandon it, and then it's at the land bank, hopefully. But we personally think that's a problem at the front end as well as the back end. So that was something that we begged them to focus on, and I would argue that we still haven't made that much progress. So that was the Housing Task Force, which was supposed to be suggestive of what to expect. What we actually got during last session was millions in resources for housing, which is great. But it's hard not to notice when you read the budget bill, which I don't recommend, it's awful. Yeah, I really don't even try, it's several hundred pages. But what you'll notice is all of the housing money is very piecemeal. It's spread across, these programs are not connected to each other, and you never really saw any one big investment anywhere. Nothing that was gonna help low-income Hoosiers, at least. And then the evident goal, where all these millions of dollars were going towards, was to build our way out of the housing crisis we're experiencing, which we definitely believe is part of it. I obviously just spent a lot of time talking about the gap, the units that we're missing. We do need a lot of new development, and again, most of our members are developers, but we find that kind of frustrating because there are a lot of other aspects of the housing crisis that we can't just ignore either. The evictions, for instance, like I said, how Indianapolis's evictions are worse than San Francisco and New York City. And in general, we are one of the worst states in the country. That is obviously contributing to our housing crisis and the homelessness epidemic that we have in Indiana. But they didn't want to talk about it. So again, one of our top priorities is habitability protections. I say that word more often, I should be able to say it better. But that really is, again, getting at the front end of those properties that will eventually, hopefully, end up at a land bank, those properties that are just extracted everything they can from them. And in the end years of that property, the people living there are living in absolutely horrible conditions. We have hundreds of stories from all over the state to prove it, pictures, and we're really concerned about it. And then, of course, as you may expect, several provisions from last session had to do with taking away local control to handle the housing crisis on their own. So we always fight against those, but it is a pretty difficult battle. So that was last session. But right now we're in a whole new session, and I think that's definitely worth talking about. But the session's not over, so I can't exactly tell you what the outcomes are yet. It's too soon. Technically, no bill has made it all the way through yet, although some are very close. And they still have to be signed by the governor and whatnot. So a lot is still up in the air, and all I can really tell you is about some of the bills we've seen. I can tell you which ones are dead as well, which ones are no longer moving forward. Maybe someone will bring them back again next year, maybe they won't. And which ones are still alive, but frankly, could still die. There's plenty of time for them to still die. So I'm just gonna jump into the bills, and again, feel free to ask questions. These are all pretty different topics. They just all pertain to housing in a different way. So the first one that I want to talk about is unlicensed real estate solicitors, and this was brought forward by Ed Clear. He's a really great guy, Republican, pretty reliable partner of ours. So these unlicensed real estate solicitors, you've probably heard of these, especially if you're a homeowner. These are the we buy ugly houses, we buy houses for cash, spam calling you, texting you, trying to get a hold of your properties. They are usually unlicensed, they are usually from out of state, and they definitely regularly target low-income and older Hoosiers who are especially vulnerable. Often what we're finding in the most official reports that we can find, especially with the Attorney General, is that these companies are offering a grandma with dementia in her neighborhood $50,000 for her house, which she may have gotten for right around $50,000. So she thinks that's great. I can get myself a condo instead and downsize, and she's not necessarily thinking about all the other ramifications because she may be going through something else and she's older. But that house is actually now worth $150,000, and the market's not what she remembers it to be, not even close. And there have been actual documented instances of the people who were taken advantage of by these becoming homeless because they couldn't get out of a deal that they did not understand by these unlicensed real estate solicitors who do not have their best interest in heart. They're just trying to get the property from them. So if this bill passes, it would require those solicitors to include an official disclosure saying that basically this property assessment I've given you is probably not accurate, and I advise you to consult an actual lawyer, attorney, licensed real estate agent, etc. And it has to be visible up front, so we're really appreciative of that. It also allows for 5 days to back out of the deal if it is signed, and that really does get at some of those older Hoosiers in particular, grandmas with dementia who are signing deals they do not understand and their family may not find out about right away. So, what's that, I'm sorry?
It isn't enough time.
I agree, I agree, and this bill has actually come around several times. I think anybody who works in policy will tell you that to get a good bill passed, it takes years, if not decades. And so, usually the first version of a bill that's introduced is great, and it gives tons of time to handle issues like this. And then over the years, as you're trying to get it through, it gets chipped away.
Like if I go to the junkyard and buy an engine for a car, I get a 30-day warranty on it. Bring it back and get another engine in 30 days.
Absolutely.
If there's something wrong with it, 5 days, I don't know.
I very much agree. And Representative Ed Clear, again, his earlier versions of the bill, I believe, were much, much longer periods to back out. And so far, this is the best he can get.
Is it still alive, or is this one dead?
This one is still alive. So actually, the number here, the HB 1068, I will cross that out if the bill is dead. So if I forget to say it out loud, that's how you'll be able to tell. So this one is still alive, and we've been supportive of it. I personally did testify in support of it. I believe there are chances to improve it still, and we still have the rest of the session to amend and make things better if we can. Right now, though, the goal is to just keep them alive, because once they're dead, they're dead.
But we're going to vote on the final version of this in the House on Monday.
Yeah, that's very true. And I will be watching. Another one is a very similar sort of issue. That's why I put them back to back. This is residential real estate service agreements. Really a similar issue of often unlicensed real estate companies targeting vulnerable Hoosiers. And these solicitors, what they do is they reach out to really anybody and they say, I'll give you $700 right now if you sign an agreement that if you ever sell your house, I get the rights to sell your house. I provide those real estate services to you. And that contract is usually about 40 years long on average, and also it continues even if the person dies. And essentially what happens is the person forgets because it's such a nominal deal and they really only took it because they were desperate for some money to get them through some sort of situation. But they're stuck in a 40+ year contract that they may have forgotten about, or if they die, their family may not have even known about. So if you hire a different real estate agent to sell your property within that time period, they are tracking that, and as soon as you do it, they hit you with a lawsuit. And what that does is it actually ties up the property in this huge legal battle, makes it unclear who currently has the rights to it, and creates a whole mess for these vulnerable families. And really, the whole gist is obviously this is unreasonable. Obviously this is unfair, and it's targeting people who don't understand what they're agreeing to, and the problems that it could cause them. It's just predatory. And by the way, both of these bills that I've just mentioned, the State Association of Realtors is also with us that these should be, illegal practices. So essentially, this bill would just say you can't do that. You can't have such long agreements. You can still have agreements like this. Real estate agents should have the right to offer their services over a certain amount of time, but this basically says that things like 40 years is insane. Obviously, you should not be able to do that. And then again, this bill is also still alive. So we are watching it. I did testify in favor of this one because we're trying to protect these Hoosiers. Here we go. Here's our first dead bill. You can see that's crossed out. And this one was frankly really, really scary. This was state and local policies on homelessness. And something that you need to know first before I talk about this bill is what Housing First is. And some of you may already know, but it sounds like most people here are developers, so you may not know. But Housing First is the approach to the homelessness crisis nationwide that really acknowledges with much proof over time that in order to get somebody stably housed and make sure they don't become homeless again very soon, which is a huge problem, is to make sure that they have access to the semi-permanent housing beyond just a shelter and a temporary bed before you can expect them to overcome the other issues that they're facing. If they're facing alcoholism or some other sort of addiction or severe mental health problems, really just anything in that variety, you can't expect them to make success on on those issues before they have a home. If somebody is living in the streets, it's ridiculous to go up to them and say, have you taken a class, AAA to get out of your alcoholism problem? I might have gotten the acronym wrong, but you know what I mean. That's insane. Obviously, they're gonna laugh in your face and say, I have bigger problems. Do you not see me sleeping in the street? And Housing First acknowledges that. They say, we don't expect people to overcome these huge life barriers like getting mental health help until we can first get them in a place where they don't have to worry about freezing to death in the middle of the night. Pretty basic. That's Housing First. People need housing first before you can expect them to get the other parts of their life together. And again, huge amounts of data support this. There's so much proof historically over the years. However, this bill, what it would do was it would have eliminated the state's annual appropriation to programs like this, which are with very licensed organizations who do this in a very careful, studied way. Just completely eliminated it. It would also make any street camping completely illegal unless happening in tent cities, which it very carefully defines and says that a local government has to set up. But maybe the city of Muncie is not arresting every person who is sleeping on the street. But do you think the city of Muncie is going to agree to set aside some of their own land to set up a tent city? No. But that's their only option with this bill. So really what that means is that it would just be completely illegal to be homeless anywhere in a public space because no city is going to set that up. Even if they could, they're not going to. And it would make it to be illegal to sleep on the street, so they would have to arrest those other people. Obviously, that's a huge issue. And then even worse, one of the worst parts of this bill is that it says if the city does not comply or county or whatever chooses to not comply, to not arrest those people, et cetera, the state attorney general can sue them. So if the city of Bloomington, which very often does its own thing and is very supportive of the homeless population there, if they said, yeah, we're not following this, we're just going to keep doing our own thing and providing services and not arresting people, then the state attorney general would sue them for a lot of money and force them to do it.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So if the only alternative was to arrest the homeless sleeping on the street, where did they expect that person to be tomorrow?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, is that part of the legislation?
No.
Was that never addressed?
No, they often don't think about the after part or the problem of the local government who has to handle the issue.
Hey, what if I fell asleep on a park bench? Like if I was just walking through the park, sat down.
That's a good question.
I'm tired. Can I be arrested for falling asleep on a park bench?
It's entirely possible if they had reasonable belief that you didn't have a home.
Park bench is now illegal?
Well, and like I said, this bill is dead.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Like, I own a house. Oh, yeah. Okay, buddy.
Exactly. I'm sure you do.
Going downtown.
So there were a lot of other really bad things in this bill that I'm not even going to get into because they're a little bit more technical, but essentially this was a monster, horrible bill, and we actually know that it was not written by Michelle Davis. It was written by an organization called the Cicero Institute. And if you're not familiar with this, there are these think tanks that is just a bunch of people who are bored, essentially. In other states, I believe the Cicero Institute is in Texas, maybe, and what they do is they draft policies that meet their own political agendas, and then they desperately beg legislators in other states to write that bill and introduce it because they want to pass their bills in other states. And the Cicero Institute is one very such organization, and they are known for writing this horrible version of this bill. So copy and paste this text of this bill. It's been introduced in like 20 other states already. And unfortunately, I have to say it's passed in a lot of other states. Our national partners are very closely tracking this and dumping a ton of resources into fighting off bills like this, but there are a lot of states who have already lost this battle because the Cicero Institute is extremely well funded, and what they do is they try and get into your fears. A lot of people have fears about homelessness and what that means for their communities, and they try and tap into that to pass these bills. And it's really quite scary. So I just want to say that even though we killed this bill, it is dead for this session. It cannot come back alive. It's gone. We're expecting to see this pretty much every year for the foreseeable future. This bill will come back. They will keep trying to do this because you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. So stay tuned. If you're interested in this issue, please get in touch. We're going to have to keep fighting this every single year. But thankfully, for the next few months, it is dead.
So what's a tenant city? Is that just like
Oh, I'm so sorry. Tent city. My apologies.
so they just allowed to put up tents and do whatever?
Yeah, maybe there's not an example locally. There is actually sort of. Do you? Oh, okay.
Do we really?
Does anyone want to?
Where's it at?
It's somewhere on the south side, but it's technically their residence, so I don't know.
It's by the line, what's that line, True Green or wherever?
On Hackley.
Garden.
Garden.
Woodtown?
Yeah.
Right, you're on Jacob, yeah. I was thinking True Green, but yeah, across the street from you guys. Yep.
Yeah.
I don't know why the city couldn't just be like, hey,
Well,
let's
somebody's
just
private
supply more
property.
shit,
Somebody
one outlet
allows
each,
that. Somebody allows
one
that.
service,
Somebody allows that.
and then one central shower hub, I don't know.
Some cities do try things like that, and those are considered like sanctioned tent cities. But honestly, a lot of them are not sanctioned. I imagine the one in your community is not officially sanctioned. They just let it be because they know people are desperate and they don't want to arrest them.
They're allowing.
Yeah, and that's pretty common. But what this bill would say is it has to be a government-sanctioned and functioning tent city, which no city government wants to do. They may let some be, though, that are currently there and not fight it. Bloomington has one like that. There's a park in Bloomington where there is essentially a tent city, and it's public property because it's a park. So the government could go in at any time and do sweeps and arrest people, and they have. But for the most part, they tend to leave it be. It's not an official sanctioned one. They just let it go.
Yeah, the one that's here in town, you can't even see it from the street, like you got, it's like wooded area, plus it's got a private privacy. Yeah, so you can't even see past that.
How many vents are there?
I'm gonna guess like 30.
You can kind of see it from the road, but it is kind of like, yeah, you gotta.
have to really look, you know, when
Is that over by the scrapyard?
Yeah. Right behind.
Yeah.
I always wondered what that was. I was like, that looks kind of cool back
I don't know if they would think it's cool, but yeah.
Not to belabor this point, but then, does this legislation define the difference between a campground and a tent city?
It does, yeah. Yeah. I'd be curious too. I'd have to analyze the different code citations, but.
This is private campground. Everyone here's a resident.
Camp Huntsville, there's Camp Huntsville. This is silly, this is the girls' Thank you, sorry.
No problem. All right, I'm going to keep moving because I don't want to keep you guys too long, but there are quite a few other things to talk about. They've been busy this session. Another one that is dead, and this kind of gets at something that I mentioned a couple of times earlier, something that we work on really regularly, is this issue of habitability. So to get into this a little bit more, what we're hearing from all over the state is that these out-of-state investors, and also sometimes actual Indiana investors, are buying up properties, usually in large swaths, and then that's the last investment they ever make in the property. And they let it essentially go to hell, pardon my language. And we get calls all the time from people who unfortunately think we provide direct services, and we don't. But they tell us their stories, and they say, you know, I've got a hole in my ceiling from a recent storm, and my landlord will not come fix it, even though it says in my contract they're supposed to. There are people who have faulty electrical systems that they're really worried are going to hurt them. There are people with mold in the walls and the carpet, raw wiring hanging down, all sorts of issues like that, which are actually in violation of state code. However, state code doesn't really say what happens if there's a violation. There's no teeth to it, essentially. So if you are a renter living in one of these situations, your only option in the state of Indiana for the most part is to go to code enforcement and hope that they can help you, but a lot of them frankly can't. Mostly they can just levy fines against the landlord, if they can even find the landlord. These out-of-state ones are very tricky to track down. Or they can condemn the property, which is not ideal if you have nowhere else to go because, like I said, supply is low and people do not have a lot of money. If you signed a contract that says the landlord should fix it, that is so much easier than having the property condemned and have to go find somewhere else to live. Nobody wants their property condemned. They want the landlord to just come in, send a specialist, get rid of the mold. Pretty basic. But that really means that, you know, if code enforcement can't help you, and sometimes they can, some cities have really robust and well-funded and well-staffed code enforcement, but a lot don't, your really only other option is to sue your landlord. And the whole time you have to keep paying rent. And a lot of these low-income Hoosiers can't afford to do that. Frankly, I have a good job, and I don't know that I could afford to do that. To sue my landlord, which can take months and is very expensive, while I'm also paying full rent the entire time and living with mold or raw wiring, it's ridiculous. And actually, it doesn't have to be like that. Indiana is only one of 6 states that doesn't have other remedies like that. And the 2 most common remedies are rent escrow and repair and deduct. Repair and deduct is exactly what it sounds like. It essentially means you fix the problem yourself, and then you deduct whatever you spent from your rent. That's a little bit more progressive, and it's not in as many states. What most states have is rent escrow. And what that means is that if you have one of these issues, if I've got, you know, a giant hole in my ceiling and my landlord won't come fix it, even though it says in the contract they're supposed to, I don't want to sue them. I can't afford to sue them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start paying my rent to the county clerk in the courts, and they hold it in a secure account. So I'm still paying my rent. It's just that the landlord can't have it until they fix the issue, which is a real incentive because some of these people, even, you know, there's good landlords and then there's some landlords who are really awful, but those awful landlords, the whole reason they're there is to make money. So if all of a sudden the faucet is turned off, the money faucet is turned off and they're not getting money, they're a lot more interested in fixing that hole in the ceiling all of a sudden. And we have proof of this. Like I said, this is, Indiana's only one of 6 states that doesn't have this. So it's pretty weird because it's well proven to work. So we've been trying to get that in Indiana for the last 3 years, and it's really, really hard. I'm not going to say anything too terribly specific, but just know that there is an extremely well-funded industry interest group in Indiana who kills every single one of our bills because they're very wealthy. I'm not going to tell you who it is. I feel like you could figure it out. Oh, no, I'm not supposed to. If anyone else here knows and wants to shout it out, I will turn a blind eye.
I think it's apartment owners.
Yeah, well, yeah. You want to say that a little bit louder?
The apartment owners association.
So, I kind of already explained the issue and what this bill would do, but yeah, this bill is dead once again, even though we had an amazing, committed Republican author who has good standing, which is some of the best elements you can have to pass a bill. And it's dead again, and there's not much more I can say about that. It just died only a few weeks ago. Well, really only like a week ago. It feels like it's been weeks. Absolutely. Absolutely it is. I can say this because it's a separate fact. The group that Representative Arrington listed is the #1 donor to the Indiana GOP. Yep. Oh, yes. It's very true. So, on the same note, with the same type of habitability issue, there are some other things we can do to fix the system we have other than rent escrow, but we are not giving up on rent escrow. Part of it has to do with the health departments or the code enforcement that are handling these issues. Marion County is a good example, and that's where this bill goes. But essentially, this bill was going to increase jurisdiction. So one issue that we've heard about in Marion County and Indianapolis is that if you're having one of these issues and you report it to the health department there, which is the entity there that handles it, if you are evicted because you stopped paying your rent or for some other lease violation, or you leave because you have had no heat in your apartment for 2 weeks in the middle of winter and you have to leave, if that happens, oh yes, and there are stories, lots of them. If that happens, the health department has to drop your case because it's no longer a public health issue if no one's living there. But if the health department drops your case and the investigation stops and the inspections and everything stop, then there's nothing stopping the landlord from just releasing the property just like that to someone else who will suffer the same way you did. And it's just because they lose jurisdiction. It's not because they're jerks and they just want to drop it and they're done with it. They just lose jurisdiction because it's no longer a public health issue. So what this bill would have done was given that jurisdiction back so that they could see the process through. And frankly, we still think that this bill could have used greater enforcement after those inspections, but step one is getting through the inspections at least. And then unfortunately, this bill only applied to Marion County. So this bill only died on Wednesday, and it was a huge blow to our coalition who'd been working on it very hard. But what we were hoping to do was strengthen that process and add more counties, ideally all 92 Indiana counties, for this to be applicable. But once the bill is dead, you can't do that. If it was still going through different amendments and eventually it's a Senate bill, it'd have to make its way over to the House. All of those are opportunities to fix it, add new things, make it better. But now that the bill is dead, there's nothing we can do. And the issue is done. The case is closed until next year. So these are the two bills that really get at that sort of core habitability issue that we find so concerning. And just to connect it to everything else we've been talking about, the reason that landlords can get away with this, especially these out-of-state ones, is because, again, people have nowhere else to go. Supply is so low, and they can't afford what is happening here in our markets. They have nowhere else to go. And obviously that feeds into evictions, because some people will move here from other states and think we have rent escrow, so they'll stop paying their rent and get ready to go file it with the clerk, and then they are immediately hit with an eviction notice because they didn't know we don't have it. Because why wouldn't we have it? Everyone else has it. I actually do have a story from someone from Ohio who had that happen to them. They thought they were doing everything right. They assumed this was a really basic law, and they got hit with an eviction and became homeless. So these are the types of issues that we are dealing with.
See, my thought
Yeah.
behind it is like, what I'm trying to do is like do everything so I don't have to go and fix anything for like 10 years. And I expect to go fix a little bit of drywall here and there, whatever, but I don't want to have to replace a furnace or a water heater. I want it to be all new, done. There you go, nice house.
Absolutely. Yeah, and my partner's mom is actually a landlord in rural Indiana, and she wrote a letter to the legislature, and I was distributing it, and it basically said, if you're a good landlord, this doesn't affect you, because you take care of your properties already. This would not ever affect you, because there's very specific things that have to come into play for it to even happen. But still, we've got nothing. Yeah, what's up, Nate?
Just those last two bills, and how it connects with kind of our land banking.
Please.
Kind of what you already mentioned, but the reality is that, when you talk to a lot of folks, they say, well, the market should help to solve these issues. And one of the things that we're seeing in the land bank is that, you know, Muncie's housing stock, affordable housing stock especially, is nearing its, a lot of it's nearing the end of its useful life. And so you have these properties that go through the tax sale, many of them multiple times. And when they first go through the tax sale, a lot of times the only economically viable thing to do is you purchase them and then they cut them up and turn them into rentals. That's one way you can make economic sense a lot of times for, it doesn't make a lot of economic sense for a developer to purchase a house, rehab it, and then resell. A lot of times they can't, it's not gonna work that way. So cutting it up, turning it into rentals is one. And then as these houses continue to deteriorate, it moves into a phase where no investment in the property is justifiable economically. And so you have all these situations where these landlords they're from an economic perspective, they're just trying to pull up, extract the last bit of economic viability and useful life of these houses. And so you're in this kind of dangerous, really kind of speculative, predatory market for parts of Muncie. And so some of these bills are trying to say, look, we're not against the market. The market's great, but these properties have been rejected multiple times by the market, and now we're in this place where if we don't have some type of laws and policies that protect people in these situations, then you just have you have a exploitive relationship, and that's where a lot of the houses. That's the situation they're in right now. But we're seeing that over and over again. That's where our argument as land bank is like, look, send them through the tax sale. What doesn't sell, give it to us. There's this window of time after property goes delinquent and sits there for a while. If a responsive owner takes it, you can still do something with it. But if it goes through this cycle multiple times, or what happens a lot of times is it goes to the tax sale, it sells, then it goes back to the tax sale. Then it sells again. Then it goes back to 2.8 times is the average times that a property goes to the tax sale. And that's years of setting there. So anyways, these bills are trying to get at that issue because that's not unique to Muncie. Lots of places around Indiana, it's their housing stock. If you have a new housing stock, maybe these issues aren't affordable housing stock. These are not things that, because the concern is that, oh, you're going to create more bureaucracy and people are going to just file these cases and we're going to reduce private investment because people want to deal with it. But that's not the reality of Muncie. And if they do, and I was reading about preparing to have a conversation about this bill, there are a lot of states that have done this, and it's a thorough process. The complaint to put your rent in escrow, you have to go before a judge. You've got to prove your case. It's not like you can just on a whim say, oh, I don't like my landlord, and I'm gonna stick it to him.
I just had a question about that kind of escrow situation. Have you gotten any of like the banks involved with that? I worked at a bank during the whole bust in '08 with the foreclosures and dealing with a lot of renters who they didn't even know that their rent wasn't paying their monthly mortgage payment because it would go to the landlord, and they would be willing to pay the bank, but the banks wouldn't accept that. So is there like, like a different kind of route or a bill that can be passed to where it can be stated in their lease saying, you can pay directly to the bank if you to feel more secure or to kind of avoid this bad landlord situation?
Kind of hard.
We just saw it a lot. Like I would call,
Yeah.
we would leave letters, on doors, stating foreclosure, and so they would call me and say, I'm not the owner, I live here, I pay my rent every month, what the heck? I would get that a lot.
Absolutely.
It was a very different time back then, but still something to kind of reroute these bad landlords, people that want to pay rent and stay in their homes or apartments or whatever.
Right.
To kind of
I see what you're saying. I think maybe there are two concerns here. Let's say they are actually a renter in a house that might be foreclosed. Then the reason why that bill may not work is because then you would be authorizing a third party to interact with a contract that's not theirs. The contract between the homeowner, the landlord, and the bank. And contract law is very nasty. So that would be my guess, but I don't work in contract law. So that, I mean, there could be something there.
Like I said, I saw it a lot.
Yeah.
Staying away from tax sales. Like when a property's in the tax sale, I have a client that he does good like rehab and is a good landlord, but he will knock on the door before he bids on the property. And he's like, almost every time I knock on the door, there's people living in there that aren't the owner, that aren't paying rent, and they start paying taxes.
Yeah.
So just anything.
And I could see somebody going and not paying their rent for 3 months, and then the house goes delinquent because the guy can't pay his mortgage. And then they're like, oh, well, I'll gladly take over your mortgage payments. But they weren't paying the mortgage, the
Seen
rent
that in
before.
Yorktown, when I was at the tax sale, it was like, like people living there, we're not, like, yeah, I've been there for 6 years. I'm like, you know this house is on the tax sale? And they're
Yeah.
like, no, I didn't have a clue. I'm like, I'm not here to buy this house and put these people out or put them in
Yeah.
a situation.
Yeah.
Let them go do that.
Somebody else is gonna do it.
But I, you know,
So you can work with them. You can form a payment plan, you own their house. They just pay rent.
It seems like there might be a conundrum if Vinny is rehabbing a house completely improperly that's not inexpensive, and if the low rent level is $150 a month, how can he get reimbursed for the investment he's made in the property or whatever? I mean, it seems like there's a disconnect between the cost of creating habitable housing and rent that's available to be paid.
Well, see, I expect to get paid. I expect the house to not have to be serviced for about 10 to 15 years.
Right.
So like the water heater, the furnace, as long as I go in and maintain everything, make sure everything's good, should last me, you know, relatively a long time. I'm looking for something that's going to pay me monthly, so I get that monthly, here you go,
Yeah.
so I don't have to work all the time. I'm kind of just trying to get a bunch of, I'm actually looking at a couple more properties right now. I want to do that affordable housing. There's two-story houses right next to each other. And I'm like, if I could make like 450 square foot little studio apartments with a little bathroom, kitchen, make them like $500 or $500 a month, $1 square foot or something.
I see. Here's the issue, though, is that nobody's selling them for that amount. And good landlords are, and I believe you would be a good landlord.
Yeah.
But the people who are doing this
Yeah.
are not struggling for money, and we're not worried about them suffering from foreclosure. Frankly, they are not usually good landlords. The vast majority of these cases are mega corporations who are buying them and intentionally letting them go. And they're not at risk of foreclosure, and they're not making the kind of reasonable rent payment you're suggesting. They are asking for thousands of dollars for crappy
I'm not looking to get paid
units.
back on the house in a year. I'm looking to get paid.
And they are. That's the
over-
thing. They
over
are
5
looking
years.
to get paid back
A lot of these
immediately.
corporations, they're dumping $100,000 into a house where I'm dumping 35, 40. Still really nice. I might have a couple of items that are used a year old or something, like furnace might be a year old.
Right.
I find deals all the time, and that's how I got central air in my shop for $1,000. Excellent.
I didn't mean to pick on you, Vinny, but it just seems like, you've got to be able to acquire enough savings from the rent to have your depreciation covered, so when you have to replace that water heater in 10 years, or that furnace in 20 years, you've got the capital to do it.
Yeah, and what I'll probably do is I'll probably just start dumping everything into an account.
Yeah.
And so anytime anything needs fixed, I'll just go over there and get it fixed, or if I get too busy with something else, I might send a friend of mine over to get it fixed. So.
But there's a general question of how do you make affordable housing match up with the cost it takes to rehab or rehab and then maintain a decent property?
Yeah, and a lot of our members are developers, so we do talk about this pretty often. Some things that I didn't talk about as much, like those millions of dollars that went into housing, a lot of it did go to subsidize development and redevelopment programs through IHCDA and so forth. That's something that we lobby for every year. Always trying to get more, but it's hard to get money for that. It's hard to get money for anything, really. So I don't disagree. I think the core part of this, though, not getting into the cost and benefit of being a developer or being a landlord, is the fact that these landlords wrote in their contract that they would provide these things, and now they aren't. And it's in violation of state Indiana code. That's the core part of this issue, is that they are supposed to provide it, And frankly, if they can't turn a profit on it, and if they can't turn a profit on it in an ethical way, stop being a landlord.
And another
Yeah.
thing is like with this house that I'm doing right now, I have a really good friend of mine, and she does like short-term Airbnbs for traveling nurses and construction companies and stuff like that. So it has to be in tip-top shape all the time.
Yeah.
Because like there might be a family of 3 in there, a family of 4 that need to use the house for 6 months. So it needs to be ready to have someone in there for 6 months or 2 weeks, you know.
That's great.
But I want to do that because it's going to maximize my profits. But I want to do those 2 houses just to give affordable housing to people in the neighborhood. So.
All right, I'm going to keep going because there are just 2 more bills to talk about, and I know that Nate wanted me to talk more about the prospect of land banks because it's been having a lot of trouble. So one really quickly that is in relation to land banks, oh, I went past it, is community land trusts. And I don't believe there's one in the area, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Community land trusts are really interesting. They're well developed in a lot of other states, and there are a few baby ones here in Indiana. But essentially what community land trusts do is they permanently keep a house at an affordable rate, which does change over time, of course. But the best example is essentially that a nonprofit, which is a community land trust, much like a land bank, it might be quasi-governmental, whatever, what they do is they buy land and property, and then what they do after that is they sell the improvement on top of the land to a homeowner, but only the improvement, not the land underneath it itself. And it's a whole special type of deed contract setup. But the way that they use that to keep prices affordable is they are able to act, again, as a nonprofit. So the Land Trust of, the Community Land Trust of Indianapolis is a real thing. And what it does is it will buy a house and obviously the land underneath it, and then it will sell me the house for $100,000, which is obviously way below market rate. And the reason they can afford to do that is because they are a nonprofit and they're able to utilize tax breaks and things like that, special programs with banks, et cetera. And that means that I get a chance at home ownership, which I may not have had otherwise. And then I can live there because I am owning the home, the improvement on the property for decades, and I build my assets and my credits and keep my life together. And then one day I'm ready to get out of there. I'm ready to go and buy my own house actually at the market rate. And that's the goal, is to get people ready to reach that point. And so then I say, okay, Community Land Trust, I can't just sell the house to anybody because you own the property underneath it, but I'll sell it back to you, and I'm gonna sell it back to you for $150,000. And that's still way below market rate, right? But it's me profiting $50,000 off of this house. So now I have built an asset in my life, I have equity, and I can go and enter the market as an actual, purchaser, because I've had time to build up these things. And then the Community Land Trust has the property back, and they say, well, the market's changed. We once sold it to a new budding homeowner for $100,000. We're gonna sell it to the next one at $120,000 because the market's changed. But that is still much subsidized from where it was. And so by the Community Land Trust owning the property itself, they are able to pass on the home over and over again to people who have otherwise a lot of trouble breaking into the home ownership market. So that they can build up those assets, build that equity, and eventually move on from the property so that someone else can have a turn. These already exist. We don't need a law to make these exist. What this bill would essentially do, though, is to make sure that when these houses are assessed for property tax, they are assessed on the amount it's sold for and not the market rate. Because if I bought that house for $100,000 and that's what I could afford, determined by all of these special programs I had to go through to get it, then me getting taxed at the market rate value of the house for $230,000 is gonna make it so it's no longer affordable to me, and it ruins the program. So this would essentially ask the property tax assessors to instead value it at what it was sold for and not the actual market rate, understanding that this is an official nonprofit or quasi-governmental program. So that's what CLTs are. They do exist. This would enable them to do their job a little bit better.
Just one plug. CLT is really interesting, kind of like mechanism, tool that's kind of starting to gain some momentum as affordable housing and, not just affordable housing, people that are professionals struggle to have houses. But you know, in essence, it's basically a tool for people to work together to deal with the issue. And we're going to have Dr. Michael Buriati, I think that's how you say his last name. He's an urban planning professor from Ball State. He's going to come and talk. He's done all kinds of research on CLTs. He's going to come for the May meeting to talk about CLTs. So I'm really excited because this is a fascinating topic.
Yeah, it's really cool. And it is pretty underdeveloped in Indiana currently. There are a few, like I said, in different cities that are quite small currently, but this is really well developed in other states. So there are a lot of researchers who know a lot about it, who've seen them, and you can also talk to people in other states who have them and know about them. For instance, Minnesota has so many of these, and they are amazingly well functioning. So they're all over the place. But it is essentially another tool in the toolbox to address the housing crisis that we have. So we're very supportive of this. This bill is dead. It was its first time, though, being introduced, as far as I know, at least in this iteration. So, you know, most things don't get through on their first try. We're going to keep bringing it back. And then, of course, land banks. I put here, talk to Nate and the Muncie Land Bank. They know way more about this than me. But, you know, land banks take vacant and abandoned property and bring them back to usefulness for the community in a variety of different ways, which can be affordable housing, it can be other things, depending on how you're set up. But this bill is unfortunately dead this year, but it would have provided financing options to land banks to grow their capacity and, you know, do the various functions they need to. It would clarify the roles of local government in these types of partnerships and what, you know, local government employees can do in involvement with a land bank, and also outline a clearer process for how land banks can acquire that property. And again, Nate knows way more about this than me. I was not the lead on this bill, my colleague was, but really great bill and really quite fortunate to have Elizabeth Rowray on the bill this year. Representative Arrington has been a real leader on this, and I think you all should thank her very much. But Elizabeth is also great, and frankly, it does help to have a Republican sometimes, right? And she's fierce. I have met with her a couple of times about this bill. She gets it, at least, you know, as much as somebody who doesn't work at a land bank can get it. And she's really into economic development. She is strong. She's a fighter. I believe this bill will get through under her in the next year or two. So.
How many times has this bill been seen or been put through?
At least Tim Lannon had it first.
Yeah.
And I was the sponsor of the House.
Yeah.
It always died in the House. It would make it through the Senate and die in the House. And I have to say, she has had an evolution in thinking, because I think in the first year that she was in the legislature, she opposed, I believe. But I think
She had a misunderstanding about how they worked.
yeah, I think she, not maybe being with the Chamber of Commerce helps too. But I think she now understands, and part of that's because of, you know, advocates, Nate, you and John West and others who have done education with her.
And Nate was actually at the meeting where she agreed to take up this issue with Prosperity Indiana. That was
There's a legislature.
that was like a coffee shop or something.
Concannons, yes.
Yeah.
It was the Concannon Donuts. But she's, Rep. Rowray has really started to become passionate and kind of a champion for these issues here. In Muncie, there's going to be a housing summit that she's been key in kind of organizing. In April, y'all get the announcement whenever it gets. But so it's great to have more allies in this.
Donuts like that, it's gonna win.
I think it will.
But in essence, you know, I know we're getting late, so I won't go into too much detail, but the land banking legislation, you probably heard me say this, in Ohio and Michigan, they have a land bank in every county. Because there's land banking legislation that supports land banks. And so they flourish, which basically means that the city and the county are, you know, obliged, highly encouraged to work and support land banks with property and money to function. In Indiana, that's not the case. And as a result, we have 6 land banks, 5, 6 right now, but it's picking up steam. And it's partly because the issue of housing is it's in our faces. And so land banks are a tool, not the solution necessarily, but a tool to help address the issue. This bill was basically, it was really gentle. You know, it was was talking about making sure that the board that sits behind the land bank, they're people that have technical expertise related to land banking, not just friends of the folks doing the appointments. It suggested some finance mechanisms through the tax sale. Maybe you charge an extra $50 for somebody, and things like that could be funneled to the land bank. And then there was a suggestion about the time frame. So right now, if we ask for a property from the county and they acquiesce, we can redeem that property in 6 months. Any nonprofit can do that in 6 months. A private citizen, it takes a year. And so this bill was talking about land banks being able to cut that down to 3 months. I mean, we'd love to be able to do it in 30 days. But anyways, that was it. It was all just kind of like recommendations, because there are a lot of land banks that are wanting to form places like Muncie around the state, and it's good to just have some policy suggestions, not something that necessarily obliges people to do it this way. But that's what the law was. But I think if one of these would get passed, even though it's not going to change our reality, you can build on it. So maybe 5-10 years, when people start to see land banks pop up and they start to become something that people understand and an effective tool, then you can actually say, well, maybe it's time to create some legislation that really gives land banks some leverage. That's my take on it.
I think the understanding is a big part of it. This summer alone, fall, between like August and November, I guess, I had over 22 conversations with different legislators about land banks and some other things, but specifically land banks was always in the mix. And they don't understand it right away. Not all of them are developers. Not all of them have been around a land bank before to have some understanding of how this works and how it might affect, the county or the city or whatever. So it does take a lot of explaining. And like I said earlier, there's kind of the saying amongst lobbyists like me that good bills take years to pass because they're complicated sometimes. That's why it's going to be a good solution, right? Because it's a little bit complicated and the issue is complicated. So it takes a lot of time. I definitely have spent a lot of hours this summer, this fall, trying to explain how land banks help their communities. And even though it may sound obvious to some folks in the room, it's not obvious to everybody. And in order to get that vote, it needs to be obvious. So I'll say that. And then I want to talk a little bit about the road ahead for land banks specifically, because I know it's of interest to this group. There's a lot that could be said, and we can do more strategizing together another time. But the key bit of advice that we have at this stage of the bill, this life cycle for the bill, is to prioritize relationships and finalize any bits of bill language later. As I've said, the introduced bill is in no way the final version of the bill. There are so many chances for additional amendments in one chamber, in committee, in the other the other chamber, in the other committee. So many chances to refine language in a different way that may be even better. Also things to watch out for in case something gets taken away that you wanted to keep. But before you can even get that far, in order to get a hearing, from the chairman and things like that, relationships have to come first. And I think this bill is at that point where it has to be the top priority now. The bill text that we've been reusing is great. Thank you for all of your hard work on it. But it's time now to turn our attention to the people who keep telling us no and finding out why and building relationships with them to move it forward. So I have put a list of names here of some of the folks that need to have those relationships built. For group strategy, the Association of Indiana Counties and Accelerate Indiana Municipalities, essentially the Association for Cities. These are two groups that really need to be testifying in favor of this bill the next time it gets a hearing. And frankly, you want them to be so much on your side that they will bring it up to a legislator before a hearing is even decided, because that's going to help you get the hearing. I'm telling you right now that if these two groups told the chairman, yeah, I think that bill's nice, I'd actually like to give it a hearing and see what people have to say about it, it'll get a hearing. I promise. And so, yeah, exactly, especially that first one for this bill in particular. Often, though, they go together. They always want to, they get involved in a lot of the same things. So getting in touch with the leaders of those groups and their lobbyists is, that's someone I'm working on. Getting in touch with them and making sure they understand land banks and see the benefits to the people they serve, aka counties and municipalities. That is one of the first steps. They are going to help you get that first hearing, and you can't do anything without a hearing. Also, obviously, you need an author who understands the issue really well. There are some of these issues that come back year after year, and the author changes, as it did in this case, and may continue to, who knows. But it's really critical that you have an author who understands it and cares about it. Payday lending is an issue that we have fought so many years, over and over. And I will frankly say that as the bill changes hands every few years, there have been some authors who maybe don't understand it quite as well as the others did. And that is not a good sign. Maybe it keeps the bill alive, keeps the message alive, but the ideal way to getting a bill passed is to have an author that really understands it and cares. And I do believe that Elizabeth does, and I know that you did too. And then also I'll add, if it's a well-respected Republican, that's even more powerful. You can always aim as high as possible. They can get the most votes the quickest. So for instance, our habitability bill, I'm sorry?
Careful saying aim, we're flashing handguns to teenage girls.
No comment. I have no comment about any of this. Yeah. I'm not allowed to. I will just say that the habitability bill that we had that very unfortunately died, the rent escrow, the author for that was Senator Greg Walker, and he is a pretty respected Republican who's been around for a while. And honestly, we really thought that that was going to move us further. And I think it did move us further than we have in previous years. But it can only do so much. We really need all of these things. But it can be an important piece of the puzzle. So, something also to consider is the committees that are involved in hearing the bill. Essentially, the committee chairman is all powerful. That's the main thing you need to know about how to get a bill passed in anywhere, really. The committee chair decides whether or not it dies. They are the first person who decides. You can author any bill on literally anything, and it will guaranteed get assigned to a committee, one of them, no matter what. But if the chairman doesn't hear it by a certain date, if he doesn't just choose to hear it, it automatically dies. And no one else on the committee can make him. Party leadership cannot make them hear the bill. So the chairman is all powerful. And unfortunately, this bill has two committees that it has to pay attention to. So not only do you need to count votes for who will vote on the bill once it has a hearing, but you have to count on that committee chair to give it a hearing in the first place. You simply cannot avoid this. It is the only way. So I just wanted to note the committees that you are facing again. In particular, local government is the first one it will go to. Usually they don't go to Ways and Means first. Usually they get recommitted. Sometimes it can go straight to Ways and Means. But this is the House Committee on Local Government. This is where Roe Ray's version of the bill went. So you can see the chairman is Representative Chris May, and he chose not to give the bill a hearing. And it doesn't matter how many other votes you count here, people who love land banks and would have voted it yes and moved it along. If Chris May doesn't give it a hearing, it's dead. So that is a name to know. That is a guy to talk to make sure that he understands how this helps your communities, because he is the end-all be-all on whether or not this bill ever gets another chance in the House. Other votes here, though, are obviously important. As soon as it sounds like that chairman is going to hear your bill, you want to start making a rap sheet of the votes you need. So I believe this committee has 13 people. That means you need 7 votes. It is never too early to start counting your votes and making it work for you. So, if I saw this list, I would go for Karen Engelman, David Hall, Jennifer Meltzer, Doug Miller. He's a developer. I think he could really be brought to understand this issue. Justin Moed will definitely understand this, Vanessa Summers. That's a lot of votes right there if you can talk to them and convince them. So it's about making a plan as early as possible. It is worth noting, though, again, that Ways and Means is another place this can go. It could get recommitted here after it's made its way through local government, or it could start here. It is possible. So then the chair, Jeffrey Thompson, again, it ends with him. So you have to start with him. Jeffrey Thompson. I actually don't know where his district is off the top of my mind, but I could look that up. I actually really like Jeffrey Thompson. He is one of those people who will sit down and really listen to you, which I cannot guarantee for all legislators, but he is very thoughtful and he wants to understand. But his number one question for any bill that has to do with taxes is, why do you deserve this? Because essentially it's a subsidy. If I am doing any kind of tax credit or exemption or anything like that of any kind, or giving you finance options or things like that, that have to do with government finance. He wants to know why you deserve that taxpayer money. And if you can't answer that question for him, you know. But he's really thoughtful. The difficult thing about this committee is that obviously there's a lot of people here. That rap sheet is a lot longer. There's a lot more votes you have to collect. But again, it's never too early to start counting your votes. So that is like my brief lobbyist intel about how to keep this bill moving. Prosperity Indiana will keep working on this bill. We will keep in touch with Nate and anyone else who wants to be involved in this. And as well, you know, Elizabeth Roray. We are not giving up on this bill. These are all strategies that I employ. It's just that, you know, you can only do this for so many priority bills. So we really do need your help to keep these conversations alive. We can't do it alone. You saw all the bills I work on. That's actually not even a third of the bills I work on. So we'll keep working on it, but we need you too. Yes?
Speak back here, but is Cherish Pryor still on this committee?
Cherish Pryor. Is she?
Yeah.
She's lovely. She's got lots of good housing bills. They just usually die.
Her sit on IDAC anyway, so I'm familiar with she is.
Great, yeah. She's wonderful.
I've been out of loop with that for a while. I used to work with that when it was Tim Brown.
Okay, yeah.
So that's why I actually was leaving.
Sure, of course. And yeah, I know it's kind of hard to see at different parts of the room, but you will get all this sent to you. So with that, I'm just going to wrap it up. Unless people have other questions, I am here, you know, until we have to leave. But if you scan that QR code, that's how you can get the digital email subscription to join the Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition. Again, it's free. It's just an email subscription. If I'm annoying you too much with my emails, you can unsubscribe at any time. And then I also included our national partner. I didn't talk about national housing legislation today, but we work on that too. So if you want to follow them. And actually, okay, I'm not seeing, oh, I'll let you scan it and then I'll change it for my email.
Any final questions or comments for Hale?
My email's right here if you have anything.
Thank you. That was really great.
Sorry it was so long. There's a lot to talk about.
It was really informative, starting with kind of the state of things here in Delaware County, and then getting into what specific bills. They're all fascinating. In 2 years of getting to know Prosperity Indiana, I feel like I started to understand how things work. Started to understand how an organization like the Land Bank can support larger statewide things. Sometimes it feels like you don't really matter, and not to toot our own horn, but because we built a relationship with Representative Roray, in a lot of ways that was part of the impetus to get her to sponsor this bill, and so having conversations with political people, it does matter. But yeah, I really want to thank you again for all the work you put in, coming down after having a really intense last while, squeezing in Muncie First Friday. And yeah, just say Prosperity Indiana is a really, really important organization for Indiana, for all of us that are connected with issues of housing and the other things that she talked about. So